Americans' appetite for housing purchase is at historical low.
The fourth quarter of 2005, the share of GDP dedicated to housing investment was at a 50-year high, about 6.6% of GDP.
You previously wrote a book on Japan's corporate governance.
Well, you've done your homework.
全球金融危机整整7年之后，发达经济体的走向仍不明朗。美国的复苏趋势总体向好，但受制于房市、特殊气候等因素，增长率仍在波动上行。而欧洲和日本则面临政治博弈和经济政策等多重挑战。在天津夏季达沃斯期间，我们请到了标普全球首席经济学家 Paul Sharp 先生，让我们听听这位全球顶级评级机构研究部负责人眼中的全球经济走向。
后危机时代，全球投资者对美国市场寄予厚望。从楼市、股市到外汇，美国经济复苏一直是投资者心中和机构口中的美好蓝图。但就在最近，美国市场的多种投资产品出现了大幅波动，市场情绪低迷，背后的原因令人深思。
So there is a new national housing market survey showing that Americans' appetite for housing purchase is at historical low. So how do you assess the recent situation, the current situation, and the outlook for U.S. housing market?
If you go back to the fourth quarter of 2005, the share of GDP dedicated to housing investment was at a 50-year high, about 6.6% of GDP. That fell in the recession down to about less than 2.5% of GDP. House prices fell. So the housing recession in the US was very, very severe and very, very prolonged, and didn't really end until perhaps the end of 2011, beginning of 2012. There has been a recovery, but it's been a relatively weak recovery. And in the last couple of quarters seems to have stumbled a little bit, particularly in the first quarter. But it looks like that was partly weather related. But I think if you just looked from a kind of cyclical perspective, the housing recovery you would still expect the housing recovery to continue. There's still a long way to go until housing activity comes back to a more normal level. But you touched, Li Wei, on an interesting question about could there be some kind of structural change in the Americans' attitude to housing. I think that's an interesting question. I haven't seen a lot of research on that, but it may well be that through the financial crisis and the slow recovery, that perhaps Americans have got less appetite now to live in big houses out in the suburbs, in driving big cars and racking up big gas bills as well.
It's more like the housing market, housing situation in China, probably. So the stock market in the US has a booming 2013. How do you see the prospect of the stock market in the US?
Well, I wouldn't want to be an economist, not an equity strategist, but you're right to point out that the S&P 500 has reached new highs, it's recovered very well, has been quite strong. That, I think, reflects primarily two or three factors. One is very aggressive monetary policy from the Fed, which has works partly through the equity market. That is, of course, aimed at trying to spur a stronger recovery. And that is the second factor, that ultimately the equity market, if it's behaving well, is discounting the future path of corporate earnings, which is very much related to the economy. And the economy has recovered in the US, not very strongly, but has been on a steady recovery path since mid 2009 or so. And I think investors look at the US economy and look at the US corporate sector in particular and see a fairly robust and strong economy, an economy that has weathered the storm of the financial crisis and the recession and looks set to continue to recover. And a corporate sector that is focused on corporate earnings and focused on so-called shareholder value. And of course many US corporations these days in the S&P 500 or the major stock indices have got very big footprints globally and exposure globally in emerging markets in particular. So I think the question is, are there signs of a bubble in the stock market? If you look at valuations, price earnings ratios and metrics like that, they may be looking a little bit stretched, but I don't think they're showing, they're flashing red signs such as we saw perhaps back in the IT bubble of the early 2000s.
与美国的总体向好，日本和欧洲都呈现出微弱复苏。在疲弱多时之后，日本和欧洲央行都做出了向市场放水的抉择，但似乎市场对这种刺激反应平平，而量宽政策的副作用正在逐步显现。
In both Europe and Japan, there is a valid concern that the monetary policy plus the mainly monetary policy will kind of delay the national government's efforts to do enough on structural reform. Do you think that's still the case?
Many people worry about that. I think that it's a little bit more, perhaps the problem is a little bit different again between Japan and the Eurozone, because in Japan it's a coordination problem I think you're talking about. How do you get coordination between monetary policy and fiscal policy and structural policy? Well, really you just in Japan need two parties to agree with one another. The Bank of Japan and the government. And they have done that to a certain extent. You can think of Abenomics as being a kind of coordination agreement between the fiscal authorities, the government on structural reform, and also the monetary authority. In the Eurozone's case, it's much more complicated because it's a game between one central bank and 18 governments, and particularly the important governments of Germany, France, Italy, Spain, etc. So it's much more complicated. I do think, as an economist looking at these issues, leeway, that a little bit too much is made of the danger that the central bank doing its job will loosen the incentives of the government, will introduce some kind of moral hazard into the government. The central bank is, in any country, a part of the government. It's usually independent within the government, not independent of the government. It's really part of the government. I think central banks need to keep their eye on that ball. What is their mandate? And not get too dragged into some complicated game that they are playing with the government.
Still on Japan, you previously wrote a book on Japan's corporate governance. Do you think this issue has really been improving in Japan? Because there are a lot of zombie companies. Similarly, in China, now more and more zombie companies are popping out.
Well, you've done your homework if you know my book from, I think, 2000 in Japan. I think corporate governance in Japan, and when I wrote that book was 2000, there was a lot of hope that there was a kind of corporate governance revolution going on in Japan. And a lot of progress had been made in the second half of the 1990s. Too long a list to go through, but it was a dramatic reform of the system. But the system didn't really deliver the outcomes that were expected. You can lead a horse to water, you can't make it drink. And so that was a disappointment. I think many foreign investors have been disappointed. Interestingly, now that debate about corporate governance is coming back in Japan. And it is one of the primary focuses of the third arrow of Abenomics, structural reforms. So I think that there is more hope this time. The tools are there. The financial system is, I think, much more mature and able to put the necessary pressure on corporate governance, on corporate managers.
鉴于世界主要经济体的这种局面，市场和学界都在探讨未来经济的走势。悲观情绪逐步蔓延，并与乐观情绪正面交锋。其实，影响格局走向的因素已经在发酵之中。
So my one last question, let's ponder for the future a little bit. Martin Wolf of Financial Times recently wrote a book, and Joe Stiglitz from Columbia, in his review, shared his sense that the list of politically feasible solutions, both in terms of national politics or banking politics is not up to the task of addressing the problem we face. Do you share that pessimism?
Well, I haven't read Martin's book yet, but I'm sure it's a very good book because he's an excellent economist and writes extremely well. I wouldn't describe myself as being pessimistic about the future. I think I'd probably put myself in the cautiously optimistic camp here. Bear in mind that the world is going through a IT revolution and a high-tech revolution. In other words, and you only have to look into your pocket, your iPhone or whatever device you're carrying to recognize that. I think the 21st century, with the IT revolution continuing, with revolutions in neurological science, the mapping of the human genome, I think we're probably on the cusp of another century of rapid technological development. I think those headwinds are dissipating now, and I think we're starting to see the possibility of central banks normalizing the monetary policy. So I think the secular stagnation debate may be a little bit late. I think if we had that debate in 2009, you could certainly say the next 5 years are going to be tough. But I think we're now looking at a slightly brighter future, particularly if the Eurozone can get its act together in terms of figuring out how they're going to evolve the economic and monetary union.
Borchardt 说，他属于一位谨慎乐观派，他并不认同其他知名经济学者和观察家眼中全球经济长期停滞等较为悲观的看法，而他的理由是全球正处在下一轮科技爆发式发展的前夕，而这样的看法将只有时间才能给出答案。